Welcome back to BBEG. This is your host, Kentwan Hawkins, and today we're going to give you the history of how Jewish people, specifically Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, ended up becoming white. The year is 70 AD, and the Jewish people were defeated by the Roman Empire. After their defeat, the Jewish temple was destroyed, and the people who fought against the Roman Empire was sent to Europe as slaves. Now, within the generation of slavery, the Jews in Europe were free and ended up becoming a part of the Roman Empire society. And it was because of this that allowed most of the Jews in the Roman Empire to go back to their homeland in Israel. Now, after the Second Jewish-Roman War, which was also called the Quito War, the Roman Emperor at the time, Hadrian, forced all the Jewish people who was living in the Roman Empire back into Israel. Now, the third and last Jewish-Roman War, which was called the Bar Kokhba Revolt, became the real de facto of Jewish diaspora. And not only he exiled the Jews from their homeland, he also murdered over 1 million Jews. And this was seen as the first genocide toward the Jewish people. Now, between the 1st century all the way up to the 7th century, majority of the world's Jews lived outside of the Roman Empire. Now, the Jews who was living inside the Roman Empire was heavily getting persecuted by other Europeans who can easily pick them out due to the fact of their different hair color, different hair texture, and their skin color was slightly darker than Europeans in that time period. And this was not the time when Jews were actually starting to get white. This was the time when Jews actually maintained their dark skin color, were the point that they were heavily targeted later on in European history. Between the 7th and 10th century, Jewish people were actually living in a golden age, not only in the Islamic states, but also in Europe. And it's around with this time where the Jewish people were intermixing with more Jewish people, which allowed them to continue to keep that indigenous Jewish look. Now, the true downfall for the Jewish people will be after the 10th century. In the 11th century, the Pope and the Roman Emperor at the time decided to band together and call out for all Christian Europeans to come and join them and fight against the Islamic states and also try to gain back their former territories. Now, the first victims of the crusade wasn't the people of Jerusalem, but the people in Germany. There were plenty of Jews in the Holy Roman Empire where were a couple princes who didn't probably like the Jewish people in the first place, decided that it was okay to go ahead and massacre almost all the Jewish people in the Holy Roman Empire. And several of them ended up fleeing to Poland. After the first crusade was established and the second crusade failed and the third crusade failed even more, the European elites were broke and they needed the Jewish people to come back so they can collect more taxes. And most of the Jewish people who were living in Poland ended up going back to the Holy Roman Empire. And this would pretty much be the downfall of the Jewish people in Europe, because a century later, after the Jews were welcomed back into Western European society, they ended up being heavily persecuted again. But this time, this was almost the final blow for the Jewish people in Europe. In 1391, the Jews in Christian Spain were getting persecuted and eventually got massacred. Were the point that majority of the Jews ended up fleeing to Al-Andalus. In 1394, just 3 years later after the massacre in Spain, the Jews in France and Germany were also getting heavily persecuted due to the Black Death, and also massacred with the point that it was just only 350 Jews who ended up fleeing this time to Poland. And strangely, the Jewish people who was getting heavily persecuted, got massacred, and was only left down to 350 people, rebounded to 50,000 people before the 16th century began. And this is when the European Jews were not white, but had a light brown skin color that was still slightly darker than the Europeans that was around them at the time. Now, while the European Jews, specifically the Ashkenazi Jews, were rebounding back to their old numbers, the Jews in Spain, specifically the Sephardic Jews, ended up being exiled from Spain and had to move into the Ottoman Empire. Well, half of them ended up moving into Portugal. The Jews in Portugal ended up being forced to convert to Christianity, and they were outcast from the rest of the Jewish people for almost over 200 years. While the Portuguese Jews, called the Conversos, ended up back into Jewish society during the 16th and 17th century, the Jewish people was living in a somewhat golden age where they were allowed to take multiple jobs that didn't involve money lending, started picking up other traits like art and music. And in between the 17th century to present time is when Jews started to look more white, and also slowly becoming the dominant of all the Jews in the world. And not just by population, of course, but also culture and education. These Jews in Europe became the leading voice for the Jewish people around the world. So the answer to when the Jews ended up becoming white, the answer is slowly around the 14th century, going all the way up to the 20th century. The first place they were accepted as white was in America, and then later on in the 19th and 20th century, they were accepted as white to the Europeans. And then in 1948, they were accepted as white around the world. And I'm going to end my video right here. Stay tuned for next week, where I'm going to talk about the Black and brown Jews and their history of how they ended up becoming the way they are, and why today Jewish people around the world, specifically in Israel, don't accept them as Jewish people. Stay tuned, subscribe, and remember, Black and brown people have an equal place in history.